Welcome to Silent Graveyard Whisperer, where we dive into the darkest corners of the unknown, unraveling stories that will haunt your mind long after the screen goes dark. If you love tales of suspense, twisted mysteries, and spine-chilling horror, then you've come to the right place. Grab a seat, turn down the lights, prepare yourself for a journey like no other, because once you step into our world, there's no turning back. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on the next terrifying story we have in store for you. Deep in the untamed Brazilian jungle of the 1990s, 5 college friends hit the road, chasing adventure and freedom. But their trip takes a sinister turn after a chilling, late-night phone call warns them of an accident that hasn't happened yet. Brushing it off as a prank, they veer onto an unmarked road and straight into the unknown. Fog rolls in thick, shadows move where they shouldn't, and whispers haunt their every step. Drawn to a mysterious clearing, they uncover an ancient evil bound to the jungle, a force that doesn't just threaten their lives, but their very souls. If you knew the road ahead led to something you couldn't escape, would you risk it anyway? The road stretched endlessly into the darkness, a thread of crumbling asphalt winding through the heart of Brazil's dense rainforest. The van's engine hummed steadily, the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The headlights fought against the encroaching fog, illuminating little more than the slick, damp road ahead and the gnarled roots of trees pushing through the forest floor. In the distance, the canopy loomed like a living wall, blotting out the moon and stars. Inside the van, 6 college friends sat crowded together, their laughter and chatter beginning to fade as the jungle closed in around them. What had started as a thrilling escape from the routines of their university lives now felt unsettling. Lucas, the unofficial leader of the group, had insisted on this trip to his uncle's cabin, describing it as the perfect retreat, remote, quiet, and surrounded by nature. His enthusiasm had been contagious, and everyone else had agreed without much hesitation. Hours into the journey, that initial excitement was long gone. The air was thick and humid, sticking to their skin like an oppressive weight. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, but no one bothered to open the windows. The jungle outside seemed alive, its sounds a strange orchestra of chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant cry of an animal. The van rattled over potholes, each jolt sending a tremor through the group's already frazzled nerves. There was no cell service, hardly surprising in 1997, and the group relied on an outdated map Lucas had brought along. Each mile felt like another step into complete isolation, the wilderness swallowing every trace of the outside world. The group's laughter grew less frequent, replaced by the occasional uneasy glance out the window or toward the darkened road ahead. The van's radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static that startled everyone. It had been silent for hours, unable to pick up any stations this far from civilization. But now, amidst the crackling, a faint voice emerged. It was barely audible at first, blending with the static in an eerie, disjointed way. As the group leaned in, straining to hear, the voice became clearer. The tone was urgent, trembling with an intensity that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The words were fragmented, distorted by the interference, but a chilling message began to take shape. It spoke of danger, a warning about something that hadn't yet happened. Before they could fully process it, the voice faded, leaving only the hum of static behind. For a moment, the van was silent, the atmosphere inside heavy with unspoken tension. The rainforest seemed to press closer, its shadows stretching further into the light cast by the headlights. Lucas tapped the radio dials, but the voice didn't return. The others shifted in their seats, glancing at one another but avoiding eye contact. The tension was palpable, like a storm cloud hanging just overhead. The road ahead grew narrower, the asphalt cracked and uneven, as if the jungle had been trying to reclaim it for years. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to a few feet in front of the van. Lucas gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated a series of sharp turns. The darkness was impenetrable, the towering trees on either side forming walls of shadow. As the van crept up a steep incline, the radio burst to life again. The static was louder this time, roaring like a living thing. The voice cut through, more distinct than before, though still warped and distant. The urgency had turned to desperation. It repeated the warning, this time mentioning an accident, a specific event waiting just ahead. The voice grew louder, almost frantic, before cutting off abruptly, leaving only an unnatural silence in its wake. No one in the van moved for a moment, their bodies stiff with unease. The air inside had grown colder, a sharp contrast to the stifling humidity outside. The rainforest seemed alive with movement, though nothing visible stirred among the trees. A faint shimmer appeared on the road ahead, just at the edge of the van's weak headlights. It looked like broken glass scattered across the asphalt, but as the van approached, it disappeared, swallowed by the darkness and fog. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but kept driving, the unease now a constant presence among them. The jungle grew denser, the road more treacherous. Each turn felt sharper, each descent steeper. Shadows danced across the windshield, though no one could tell if they were real or tricks of the mind. The forest seemed to be closing in, its whispering leaves and distant animal cries creating an unsettling symphony that filled the van. Far ahead, a faint sound echoed. It was too distant to identify, but eerily rhythmic, as though something was moving with purpose through the trees. The group exchanged nervous glances, their earlier excitement now completely replaced by a sense of foreboding. The radio remained silent, but its warning lingered, etched into their minds like a scar. The van climbed steadily, its worn tires struggling against the slick, moss-covered road. The forest seemed to tighten its grip with every passing mile, the trees leaning closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the edges of the road like skeletal fingers. The fog thickened further, now swirling in slow, deliberate eddies around the van, as if the jungle itself were alive and watching. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with an invisible tension no one could name, but everyone could feel. The humid closeness of the jungle seeped through the van's thin metal walls, mingling with the faint metallic tang of oil and gasoline. The group's earlier banter had dissolved into a strained silence, their unease festering in the void left behind. The van jolted suddenly as one wheel struck a hidden pothole, jerking everyone inside. It wasn't the first time, but the sudden movement seemed to amplify the unease. The road had become rougher, as if it hadn't been used in years. Lucas kept his eyes on the dimly lit path ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. In the back, Marta rubbed her arms, her gaze fixed on the dark jungle outside the window. She hadn't spoken much since the radio first crackled to life, but now her unease had turned to something closer to dread. Beside her, Pedro shifted nervously, his fingers drumming on his knee. None of them dared to say what they were all thinking, that something about this trip felt wrong. A low, distant noise broke the silence. It was faint but distinct, like the sound of wood creaking under immense pressure. At first, it seemed to come from the forest, but as they drove further, it grew louder. It wasn't continuous but rhythmic, like something moving steadily through the dense undergrowth. Lucas slowed the van as the road dipped into a sudden, sharp curve. The headlights swept across the trees, their beams barely penetrating the thick fog. On the other side of the curve, the jungle opened into a narrow stretch of road flanked by sheer rock walls. The road was littered with debris, fallen branches, loose gravel, and what appeared to be shards of glass. The van crawled forward, its tires crunching over the scattered fragments. The sound was unnervingly loud in the stillness, echoing off the stone walls. Something about the glass didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too perfectly placed across the road. As they passed over the debris, the van's radio erupted again, louder and more jarring than before. The static was deafening, almost drowning out the voice that accompanied it. But this time, the message was different. The voice sounded strained, almost broken, its words tangled in the static. It repeated the warning, an accident, it will happen, stop. The The final word hung in the air, cutting through the noise like a blade. Then the radio fell silent. The van continued to roll forward, its tires crunching over the glass with an almost deliberate slowness. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire jungle were holding its breath. Ahead, the fog shifted, parting slightly to reveal the road's descent into another shadowy curve. The van's headlights caught a fleeting glimpse of something at the edge of the road, a pale, hunched figure crouched among the trees. It was only visible for a split second before the van rounded the bend, but the sight left a deep, chilling impression. The figure hadn't moved. It hadn't turned to look at the van, but its presence was undeniable, a ghostly silhouette against the blackness of the forest. Lucas pressed the accelerator slightly, the van picking up speed as the road straightened out again. The group exchanged glances, their faces pale in the dim light. No one spoke. The jungle seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, the distant creaking noise growing louder, as if it were following them. The van crested another hill, and for a brief moment, the road ahead was visible. It stretched into the fog, lined with shadows that seemed to shift and ripple like water. The group's unease deepened, their fear now sharpened by the growing sense that they were not alone. Marta's gaze flicked back to the rear window, her breath catching in her throat. Something moved in the darkness behind them, a faint, flickering shape that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her seat. The van descended into another curve, the headlights struggling to pierce the thickening fog. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, an unbroken path leading deeper into the unknown. The jungle loomed on all sides, its shadows pressing closer, and the distant creaking sound grew louder, more insistent. Something was waiting for them. The van crawled forward, its headlights slicing through the fog in trembling arcs, barely illuminating the road ahead. The jungle seemed unnaturally still now, as though every living thing had stopped to watch. Even the hum of insects, so constant moments ago, had fallen silent, leaving only the van's engine and the faint creak of the wheels over uneven ground. The group felt the absence of sound like a weight pressing down on them. The forest on either side seemed alive with shadows, their forms shifting and twisting as the headlights passed. The faint shimmer of broken glass reappeared on the road ahead, scattered like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the heart of the unknown. Each piece caught the light for only a moment before vanishing into the fog, but the pattern was unmistakable, deliberate, almost as though someone had placed it there. Inside the van, the air was suffocating, thick with a tension that no one dared to acknowledge. Marta glanced over her shoulder again, her eyes darting to the rear window. The van's taillights glowed faintly, painting the swirling mist behind them in a dull, ominous red. She thought she saw movement, just a flicker, something pale slipping between the trees. Her breath quickened, but she said nothing, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her. Ahead, the road curved sharply, the jungle walls closing in tighter than before. The van's tires crunched over debris, the sound amplified in the heavy silence. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the road. His knuckles were pale, his focus unbroken, but his unease was betrayed by the slight tremor in his hands. The van lurched suddenly, the tires skidding on something slick. A low, metallic groan echoed through the cabin as the vehicle swayed, the group clutching at their seats to steady themselves. The van regained its grip, but the sound lingered, a haunting resonance that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. The radio, silent for the past several miles, sputtered back to life with a sudden burst of static. This time, the interference was harsher, almost violent, and the voice that emerged was barely human. It growled and hissed, words tangled in the chaos, but the same warning cut through the noise like a blade. "It's not too late. Stop." The voice disappeared again, swallowed by a screech of static that made everyone flinch. The van continued forward, but the warning clung to the air inside like a poison. A low rumble sounded in the distance, faint but growing louder. It wasn't thunder, it was steady rhythmic, like the groan of something immense shifting in the earth. The sound vibrated through the forest, setting the trees to trembling and sending a shiver through the group. As the van rounded another bend, the headlights caught a shape sprawled in the center of the road. It was large and unmoving, a dark mass obscured by the fog. Lucas slammed on the brakes, the van screeching to a halt just a few feet away from the object. For a moment, no one moved. The group stared at the shape ahead, their breaths shallow and quick. It looked like a tree trunk at first glance, its surface rough and splintered, but something about it was wrong. The texture was strange, almost too smooth in places, and as the fog swirled around it, the light caught glimmers of something metallic embedded in its surface. Lucas hesitated, his hand hovering over the gear shift. The rumbling sound grew louder, vibrating through the ground and up into the van. The shadows in the jungle seemed to move again, their forms flickering in and out of the headlights' reach. Behind them, the air seemed to shift, growing colder. Marta turned again to the rear window, her chest tightening as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. This time, she saw it clearly. A figure stood at the edge of the road, pale and still, its form just barely visible through the swirling mist. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, an oppressive force that seemed to weigh on her lungs. She gripped the seat in front of her, her knuckles white. When she blinked, the figure was gone, replaced by the impenetrable blackness of the jungle. The group remained frozen, their eyes locked on the dark mass blocking the road. It hadn't moved, but something about it felt alive, as though it were waiting. The forest pressed closer, the fog thickening into a near impenetrable wall. And then the lights flickered. The headlights flickered once, then again, their beams stuttering as if struggling against the weight of the fog. The group inside the van sat frozen, their breath shallow and quick, the air thick with an unspoken dread. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The soft creak of the van's frame, the faint hiss of the jungle's dampness against the windshield, and the low, rhythmic rumble that grew louder with every passing second. The dark mass ahead remained unmoving, an unnatural shadow sprawled across the road. The closer they looked, the less it seemed like a fallen tree. Its surface gleamed in places where the light caught it, a slick, oily sheen that shimmered faintly. Small, jagged protrusions jutted from its edges like shards of broken bone. Lucas kept his foot on the brake, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out the faint murmurs of his friends in the back. The fog shifted again, curling lazily around the mass, obscuring its edges. It was as if the mist itself was alive, pulling the shape deeper into its shroud. Behind them, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as though the jungle had exhaled something unnatural. Marta's eyes darted to the rear window, her chest tightening as she scanned the darkness. The taillights cast a faint red glow into the fog, creating shifting shadows that danced along the edges of the road. And then she saw it. It was no longer a fleeting flicker or an imagined movement. A figure stood at the edge of the jungle, barely visible through the swirling mist. Its pale, elongated form was almost human but wrong in subtle, indescribable ways. It didn't move, didn't sway with the wind or breathe with the jungle. It was utterly still, its presence radiating a quiet malevolence that seemed to press against the van. Marta's breath hitched. She wanted to scream, to warn the others, but the words caught in her throat. When she blinked, the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog as if it had never been there. In the front seat, Lucas tightened his grip on the wheel, his gaze flickering between the shadowed mass on the road and the fog closing in around them. The low rumble that had been growing in the distance was now vibrating through the ground itself, resonating in their bones. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like the footsteps of something enormous moving through the jungle. The headlights flickered again, plunging them into near-total darkness for a brief, suffocating moment. The van groaned as though straining under an unseen weight, the sound reverberating through the cabin. When the lights snapped back on, the dark mass in the road seemed closer, though the van hadn't moved an inch. Pedro, sitting in the back, pressed himself against the window, his breath fogging the glass. His eyes darted nervously from the road ahead to the trees on either side, their dark forms pressing in like walls. The jungle felt alive now, not with the usual hum of insects and rustling leaves, but with a slow, deliberate awareness. Somewhere in the distance, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed by a series of dull thuds, as if something heavy had fallen and shattered. The sound carried through the air like a warning, reverberating off the narrow rock walls that flanked the road. Then the van's radio sputtered to life again. The static was deafening, a harsh, grating roar that filled the cabin. It drowned out the rumbling beneath them, the creaking of the van, and even their own panicked breaths. The voice returned, distorted and broken, but unmistakably desperate. "It's close. Don't stop." The words were garbled, almost drowned in the static, but the final phrase came through with terrifying clarity. "Don't look back." The radio cut off abruptly, the silence that followed even more suffocating than the noise had been. The van's engine idled, its low hum barely masking the sound of something shifting in the fog outside. The jungle seemed to pulse, a living, breathing entity that had swallowed them whole. Marta's gaze snapped back to the rear window, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought she saw movement again, a pale blur that flickered at the edge of the taillights. But it was gone too quickly to be certain. The others shifted nervously, their unease now teetering on the edge of full-blown panic. The mass in the road loomed larger, its shadow stretching unnaturally in the van's flickering beams. Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing as he considered their options. And then, from the jungle, came a sound unlike any they had heard before. It was a low, guttural moan, layered with an otherworldly resonance that vibrated in their chests. It rose and fell like a grotesque imitation of a human voice, but it carried with it a weight, an ancient, unknowable power. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, suffusing the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. The fog thickened, pressing closer to the van, and the cold seeped into their skin. Lucas's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his instincts screaming at him to move, to flee, but the road ahead was blocked, and every shadow seemed alive with malice. Lucas gritted his teeth and shifted the van into reverse, the engine groaning in protest. The tires spun briefly on the damp road before catching, sending the vehicle inching backward. The dark mass in the road loomed larger for a moment as the headlights passed over it, revealing more unsettling details. What had initially seemed like jagged protrusions now appeared disturbingly organic, long, thin shapes that looked like twisted limbs reaching outward. The jungle closed in tighter as the van moved in reverse, the fog swallowing the red glow of the taillights. Inside, the group clutched their seats and each other, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. No one spoke. The oppressive silence of the jungle had returned, but now it was laced with the faint, rhythmic rumble that grew louder with each passing second. Marta's eyes stayed locked on the rear window. The pale figure she'd seen earlier flickered at the edges of her vision, reappearing briefly before vanishing into the mist. Each time it returned, it seemed closer, its stillness more menacing. And then the van jerked to a sudden stop. The group lurched forward, gasping as the vehicle shuddered. Lucas slammed the brake, his heart racing as he glanced at the rearview mirror. The red glow of the taillights illuminated the narrow stretch of road behind them, but something blocked their path. It was another dark mass, smaller than the one ahead but just as unnatural. It sprawled across the road, glistening faintly in the light, its surface marred by jagged edges that jutted outward like splinters. Lucas's chest tightened. They were trapped. The jungle seemed to come alive around them, the shadows between the trees shifting and writhing. The distant rumble grew louder, accompanied by faint whispers that slithered through the fog like tendrils of smoke. The whispers were unintelligible, but they carried a weight that made the air inside the van feel heavier, suffocating. Pedro leaned forward, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the trees. His face was pale, his wide eyes reflecting the dim light. Through the fog, the group saw faint glimmers of movement, pale shapes flitting between the trees, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. Lucas gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. The van couldn't go forward, and reversing was no longer an option. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but the road ahead and behind were blocked, and the jungle offered no escape. Then, without warning, the van's engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sounds were the faint creaks of the van settling and the distant, rhythmic rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The headlights dimmed, their beams flickering weakly before going out entirely, plunging the group into near-total darkness. Panic erupted inside the van. The group scrambled to find their flashlights and phones, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Outside, the jungle seemed to press closer, its shadows reaching out with unseen hands. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their unintelligible words laced with urgency and malice. Marta's flashlight clicked on, its weak beam cutting through the fog. She aimed it toward the front of the van, her hands trembling. The dark mass that had blocked their path was still there, but now it seemed to writhe, its surface undulating like something alive. A loud crack echoed through the jungle, followed by a deep, guttural roar that reverberated in their bones. It came from somewhere deep within the fog, its source unseen but unmistakably close. The sound carried a raw, primal power, like the voice of something ancient and angry. Lucas's heart pounded as he fumbled with the keys, desperate to restart the engine. The ignition clicked repeatedly, but the van refused to come back to life. The whispers outside grew louder, converging into a cacophony of overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. The fog thickened further, pressing against the van's windows like a living thing. Then came the first strike. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the cabin as something hit the side of the van. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Another clang followed, louder and more forceful, as though something was testing the vehicle's defenses. Marta swung her flashlight toward the sound, its beam catching a fleeting glimpse of movement. A pale hand, elongated and unnatural, pressed against the window before vanishing into the fog. The group erupted into chaos, their fear spilling over into frantic shouting and desperate attempts to open the van's doors. But the locks wouldn't budge, and the windows were slick with condensation, obscuring their view of whatever lurked outside. Another strike shook the van, this time from the roof. The metal groaned under the weight of something heavy, its surface denting inward. The group cowered, their terror now overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noises stopped. The whispers faded into silence, the strikes ceased, and the fog seemed to lift slightly, revealing the road ahead. The dark mass was gone, leaving only an empty, debris-strewn path. The jungle was still again, its oppressive weight lifting just enough to let them breathe. Lucas turned the key one last time, and the van roared to life. Without hesitation, he threw it into gear and sped forward, the tires skidding over the slick road. The group remained silent, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, their minds racing with the horrors they'd just endured. But as they drove deeper into the jungle, the low, rhythmic rumble returned, growing louder with each passing second. They hadn't escaped. As the van roared forward, its engine sputtered, coughing as though choking on the heavy, humid air. The tires skidded on the wet road, sending the vehicle fishtailing for a moment before Lucas regained control. The fog still clung to the jungle, twisting and curling like spectral hands reaching out to pull them back. The oppressive silence that followed the earlier attack was worse than the noise. The group sat rigid, their breathing shallow, their senses heightened to every sound, every flicker of movement outside the van. The faint glow of the headlights barely pierced the fog, casting distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with life. Marta kept her flashlight gripped tightly, her hands trembling. She swept the beam across the windows, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the jungle. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches arching over the road like skeletal arms. Every shadow felt alive, every shifting form a potential threat. Pedro pressed himself against the back of his seat, his eyes darting nervously toward the rear window. The taillights cast a dim, eerie red that barely penetrated the fog, creating a disorienting sense of confinement. His mind raced with thoughts of the pale figure he'd glimpsed earlier, its unnatural stillness seared into his memory. The The rhythmic rumble returned, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was closer now, its pulsing rhythm almost like the heartbeat of the jungle. Each wave of sound sent shivers through their bodies, an instinctive reaction to something primal and deeply wrong. And then the van jolted violently. Lucas slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the van skidded to a halt. The group was thrown forward, gasping as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. The headlights flickered weakly, their beams dimming as the van's engine sputtered once, twice, and then died. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. The jungle seemed to press closer, the fog swirling thickly around the van. The rhythmic rumble had stopped, replaced by an oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on their chests. Marta's flashlight beam shook as she aimed it toward the road ahead. The path was clear, the dark mass that had blocked their way earlier gone, as if it had never been there. But something about the emptiness of the road felt wrong. Too open, too inviting, like a trap waiting to spring. From the roof of the van came a faint, creaking sound. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the whisper of leaves brushing against the metal. But it grew louder, more deliberate, as though something heavy was shifting its weight. Pedro's breath hitched as he pointed upward, his eyes wide with terror. The others followed his gaze, their hearts pounding as the sound of scratching claws echoed from above. It moved slowly, deliberately, tracing a path across the roof with an eerie precision. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His mind raced, but there was no clear course of action. The engine was dead, the van was surrounded by fog, and whatever was on the roof was far beyond his understanding. The creaking stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening thud as something heavy landed on the hood of the van. The vehicle rocked under the weight, its suspension groaning in protest. Marta swung her flashlight toward the windshield, the beam cutting through the fog to reveal a horrifying sight. A figure crouched on the hood, its pale, elongated body contorted in unnatural angles. Its skin was slick and glistening, like it had been pulled from the depths of a swamp. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its hollow, black eyes stared unblinkingly into the cabin. Time seemed to freeze. The figure didn't move, its gaze fixed on the group with a quiet, suffocating malice. The fog outside seemed to thicken further, pressing against the windows, isolating them completely from the world beyond. Then, with an unnatural fluidity, the figure raised one skeletal hand and pressed it against the windshield. The glass groaned under the pressure, faint cracks spidering outward from where its fingertips touched. Lucas's hands trembled as he turned the key in the ignition again. The engine clicked, sputtered, and roared to life. The sudden noise broke the spell, and the group screamed as the figure on the hood let out a guttural, otherworldly shriek. Without hesitation, Lucas slammed his foot on the accelerator. The van lurched forward, the tires spinning briefly before catching the road. The figure on the hood clung tightly, its skeletal limbs splayed across the glass, its face twisted into an expression of rage. The van picked up speed, careening down the narrow jungle road. The branches of overhanging trees scraped against the sides, their sharp edges clawing at the windows. The figure on the hood held fast, its black eyes burning into theirs as it let out another inhuman wail. Pedro grabbed a flashlight and aimed it directly at the creature's face. The light seemed to momentarily disorient it, causing it to release its grip and tumble off the hood. The van swerved as Lucas fought to regain control, the tires skidding on the damp road. For a brief moment, the road ahead was clear. The fog seemed to part, revealing a stretch of open jungle. The rhythmic rumble returned, faint but steady, as though the jungle itself was mocking their escape. But then, from the rear of the van, came the unmistakable sound of clawed hands scraping against metal. The sound of claws scraping against the rear of the van sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through the group. It was relentless, a jagged screech that rose above the roar of the engine and the rhythmic rumble that seemed to follow them no matter how far they drove. Marta turned in her seat, the beam of her flashlight trembling as she pointed it toward the back. The rear window was fogged over, but faint, distorted shapes moved behind the glass. It was hard to tell how many there were, but they were fast, darting in and out of the red glow of the taillights. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices that slithered into their minds. They weren't just sounds anymore. They felt invasive, as though the voices were inside the van, clawing at their thoughts. The words were still unintelligible, but their intent was clear, malevolent, hungry, and closing in. The van jolted violently as something struck the back, the force of the impact rattling the windows. Lucas tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white as he pushed the van to its limits. The narrow road twisted and turned, the headlights catching fleeting glimpses of the jungle rushing past, gnarled trees, dense undergrowth, and shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. From the roof came a series of rapid thuds, followed by a long, drawn-out scrape. Whatever had climbed onto the vehicle earlier was back, and it was making its way toward the front. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look up, but the others couldn't tear their gaze away. Through the windshield, they could see faint impressions on the metal above, shadows of long, spindly limbs pressing against the surface, their movements deliberate and methodical. The van shuddered as the weight shifted, the creature's progress punctuated by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around them. Marta's flashlight beam wavered as she aimed it upward, illuminating a flash of slick, pale skin before the creature darted out of sight. Its speed was inhuman, its movements unnatural and jerky, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Pedro pressed himself against the back of his seat, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The scraping at the rear of the van intensified, the metal groaning under the assault. He couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, his stomach churning as he caught a glimpse of multiple figures now clinging to the back. They weren't entirely visible, just flashes of long, skeletal hands and pale, glistening skin, but their presence was undeniable. They moved in unison, their clawed fingers digging into the metal as they pulled themselves closer. The jungle seemed alive with movement now. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, darting between the trees and along the edges of the road. The rhythmic rumble had grown louder, its pulsing beat vibrating through the van like the drum of some ancient, malevolent force. And then the road split. Lucas slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the van skidded to a halt. The headlights illuminated two paths ahead, one veering sharply to the left, narrow and overgrown with foliage, and the other leading straight into a dense wall of fog. Neither option seemed safe, but staying still wasn't an option. Before anyone could speak, the van rocked violently as the creature on the roof began to pound against the metal. The sound was deafening, each impact shaking the vehicle and driving the group closer to hysteria. Without thinking, Lucas chose the left path. He yanked the wheel and hit the gas, the van lurching forward and crashing through the overgrown foliage. Branches scraped against the sides, their sharp edges clawing at the windows like desperate fingers. The road was uneven, filled with potholes and loose gravel that sent the van bouncing wildly. The creatures clinging to the back struggled to hold on, their clawed hands slipping against the slick metal. One of them lost its grip, tumbling into the darkness, but the others held fast, their pale forms illuminated briefly in the flickering red light of the taillights. Inside the van, the air was thick with fear. The whispers had grown louder, their cadence faster and more urgent. It was as if the jungle itself was alive, urging the creatures forward, feeding their relentless pursuit. And then the roof gave way. A deafening screech of tearing metal filled the cabin as claws punched through, raking across the ceiling. Marta screamed, shielding her head as bits of debris rained down. The creature's hands were inside now, long and skeletal, groping blindly for anything within reach. Lucas swerved violently, the van skidding dangerously close to the edge of the narrow road. The sudden movement dislodged the creature, its body thudding against the side of the vehicle before disappearing into the darkness. But the relief was short-lived. Ahead, the road narrowed further, the jungle closing in tightly on either side. The branches overhead formed a canopy so dense that even the fog couldn't penetrate it. The darkness was suffocating, the headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. And then the rhythmic rumble stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, more oppressive than the noise had ever been. The whispers ceased, the jungle fell still, and even the fog seemed to hang in anticipation. Lucas slowed the van, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The others held their breath, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But the jungle was empty now, eerily so. The shadows that had once darted between the trees were gone, leaving only an unsettling void. The van crept forward, its tires crunching softly against the gravel. And then they saw it. The road ahead ended abruptly, dropping off into a steep ravine. The van skidded to a stop just in time, the group staring wide-eyed at the sheer drop before them. Below, the jungle stretched out endlessly, its dark expanse illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. But it wasn't the ravine that held their attention. Standing at the edge of the drop, silhouetted against the mist, was a figure. Its form was tall and impossibly thin, its arms hanging limply at its sides. The pale, glistening skin reflected the dim light, its hollow eyes staring directly at them. And behind it, more figures began to emerge from the fog. The van trembled at the edge of the ravine, its headlights casting long, flickering beams into the abyss. The sheer drop was dizzying, the darkness below swallowing the light. The jungle stretched endlessly on either side, its oppressive presence a living force pressing down on them. The figure at the edge of the cliff stood impossibly still. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Its gaunt form, stretched and pale, seemed more an extension of the jungle itself than a living thing. Its hollow eyes bore into the van, unblinking and eternal, as though it could see straight into their souls. And then the others emerged. One by one, they stepped out of the fog, their movements jerky and unnatural. Each figure was identical to the first, their long limbs and featureless faces grotesque in the flickering light. They formed a line at the edge of the ravine, a silent and unnerving congregation. The group inside the van sat frozen. No one dared move or speak. Marta gripped her flashlight tightly, its weak beam trembling as she aimed it toward the figures. The light caught one of them squarely in the face, or where a face should have been, and it recoiled slightly, its head tilting as though confused. But the reprieve was brief. The rhythmic rumble returned, deeper and more resonant than before. It vibrated through the ground, shaking the van and rattling their bones. The figures at the edge didn't move, but something in the air shifted. The jungle seemed to close in tighter, the shadows deepening and writhing as though alive. From behind the van came the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. Lucas gripped the wheel, his pulse racing as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The fog obscured everything, but faint shapes moved in the distance, growing larger and more defined with each passing second. They weren't alone. Pedro turned toward the back window, his breath hitching as he caught sight of the creatures emerging from the jungle. They were smaller than the ones at the edge of the ravine, but no less terrifying. Their bodies were hunched and twisted, their clawed hands dragging along the ground as they moved. The van rocked as something slammed into its side. The group screamed, clutching their seats as the vehicle swayed dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Lucas slammed his foot on the brake, keeping the van from rolling forward. But the figures were closing in. The ones from the jungle advanced steadily, their movements erratic and unpredictable. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Others shuffled upright, their heads lolling to the side as though their necks couldn't support their weight. The group's terror mounted as the whispers returned, louder now and more distinct. The overlapping voices no longer felt like gibberish. They were words, fragments of sentences spoken in a language that none of them recognized but all instinctively feared. The words were sharp and guttural, each syllable cutting into their minds like shards of glass. Lucas gritted his teeth and threw the van into reverse. The tires spun on the loose gravel, the vehicle lurching backward as he tried to put distance between them and the edge of the cliff. The headlights swung wildly, casting chaotic beams of light that illuminated the advancing creatures. The pale figures from the ravine began to move. Their jerky, marionette-like motions were unsettling, their limbs twisting in impossible directions as they stepped away from the cliff's edge. They moved in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on the van, their purpose clear and unrelenting. The van jolted again as another impact shook its side. Marta's flashlight slipped from her hands, its beam bouncing wildly around the cabin before landing on the floor. The group scrambled to pick it up, their panic rendering them clumsy and disoriented. Outside, the creatures closed in. The smaller ones from the jungle were now just feet away, their clawed hands reaching out to grasp the sides of the van. Their skin was slick and glistening, their elongated fingers leaving smears of an oily, black substance on the windows. Lucas floored the gas, the van lurching backward with a screech. The sudden motion threw the smaller creatures off balance, some of them tumbling to the ground. But the pale figures from the cliff moved faster, their long limbs carrying them across the distance with terrifying speed. The van's rear wheels caught on something, a root, a rock, it didn't matter. The vehicle shuddered to a halt, the engine sputtering in protest. Lucas slammed the gearshift, his heart pounding as he tried to free the wheels. From the roof came another sharp, metallic clang, followed by the sound of claws raking against metal. The group looked up in unison, their terror mounting as they saw the roof begin to dent inward. Whatever was up there was stronger, more deliberate, and far more dangerous than the smaller creatures outside. The fog thickened again, swirling around the van and obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The headlights dimmed, their beams flickering weakly as though the darkness itself was draining their power. And then the roof gave way. A skeletal hand punched through the metal, its clawed fingers grasping blindly for anything within reach. The group screamed as more hands joined the first, tearing through the roof with horrifying ease. The pale figures had reached the van, their hollow eyes now visible through the jagged holes they'd created. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening cacophony that filled the cabin and drowned out the group's own cries. The sound was overwhelming, a relentless assault on their senses that left them clutching their heads in agony. And through it all, the rhythmic rumble grew louder, its pulsing beat shaking the very earth beneath them. Lucas's vision blurred as he fought to restart the engine, his hands slick with sweat and trembling uncontrollably. The van sputtered, coughed, and roared to life just as one of the pale figures reached inside, its clawed hand grazing Marta's arm. With a desperate scream, Lucas floored the gas. The van surged forward, its tires finding traction at the last possible moment. The creatures clinging to the roof were thrown off, their twisted forms tumbling into the fog as the vehicle careened down the narrow path. The group barely had time to process what had happened. The jungle was alive with movement now, the shadows closing in on all sides. The road twisted and turned, the van bouncing wildly over every bump and dip. But the rhythmic rumble didn't stop. It followed them, relentless and unyielding, a reminder that their escape was far from certain. The van hurtled down the treacherous jungle road, the roar of its engine barely masking the cacophony outside. The rhythmic rumble had become a relentless pulse, resonating through the ground and air alike, matching the frantic pounding of their hearts. The oppressive fog pressed in tighter, its density blurring the edges of reality, twisting shapes into grotesque figures that loomed and leered as they raced by. The whispers turned to screams again, filling the air with overlapping, guttural wails that carried raw hatred. It was no longer just a sound, it was a force. It invaded their minds, flooding them with images they couldn't comprehend. Flashes of dark shapes writhing beneath the jungle floor, ancient altars slick with blood, and hollow, black eyes staring from every shadow. Lucas fought to keep the van on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The tires skidded on the slick surface, the narrow path winding sharply between the trees. Each turn felt tighter, more precarious, as though the jungle itself was conspiring against them. Pedro was the first to notice. He pointed with a trembling hand toward the dashboard, his voice lost in the chaos. The fuel gauge was dropping rapidly, the needle plummeting toward empty as though drained by an unseen force. The van's engine sputtered, its once reliable roar now uneven and faltering. Marta clutched the flashlight tightly, her wide eyes scanning the fog-shrouded road ahead. The beam caught fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows darting across the path, twisted limbs reaching out from the underbrush. It was impossible to tell how many there were, but they were everywhere, closing in like a pack of predators. And then they saw it. The road ended abruptly, just as it had before, but this time there was no choice. A towering tree had fallen across the path, its massive trunk blocking the way entirely. The fog thickened around it, swirling unnaturally, as though alive. Lucas slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the van skidded to a stop mere feet from the obstruction. The group was thrown forward, their breath knocked out of them as the vehicle jolted violently. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then died. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. The whispers and screams ceased, replaced by an oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on their chests. The rhythmic rumble had stopped as well, but its absence was no comfort. It felt like the calm before the storm, a moment of eerie quiet that made their skin crawl. Pedro was the first to move, his shaking hands fumbling for the door handle. Before he could open it, a loud thud came from the roof. The group froze, their eyes darting upward as the sound repeated, a slow and deliberate pounding that sent vibrations through the van. And then the roof began to cave in. The metal groaned and buckled as something massive pressed down from above. Long, skeletal fingers punched through, their claws scraping against the interior as they searched blindly. Marta screamed, her flashlight beam catching the pale, glistening skin of the creature's hand. Lucas scrambled to restart the engine, but it was no use. The key turned uselessly in the ignition, the van unresponsive as the roof continued to give way. Pedro grabbed a tire iron from the floor and swung it wildly at the invading claws, but his strikes had little effect. Then the fog moved. It wasn't natural. It swirled and coiled with purpose, flowing into the van through every crack and crevice. It wasn't just mist, it was alive, sentient, and malevolent. It filled the cabin with an icy chill, stinging their skin and searing their lungs. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words now clear and horrifying. "You cannot escape." The group screamed as the fog enveloped them, its tendrils wrapping around their limbs and pulling them toward the windows. Marta fought desperately against its grip, her flashlight tumbling from her hands and rolling under the seat. Pedro swung the tire iron again, but the fog was intangible, slipping through his grasp like smoke. And then they saw it. Through the windshield, beyond the fallen tree, the fog parted to reveal a horrifying sight. The pale figures from before were gathered there, their hollow eyes staring unblinkingly at the van. They stood in a perfect circle, their spindly arms raised toward the sky. At the center of the circle was a massive, pulsating mass of darkness. It was alive, its surface rippling with movement as though countless creatures writhed beneath its skin. The rhythmic rumble returned, emanating from the mass with such intensity that the ground trembled beneath it. The realization hit them all at once. This was the source. The figures, the whispers, the fog, all of it was connected to this ancient, unknowable entity. It wasn't just chasing them, it was toying with them, herding them like cattle toward their doom. The pounding on the roof grew more frantic, the claws tearing through the metal with unnatural strength. The fog thickened inside the van, its cold tendrils wrapping tighter around their throats. Lucas's vision blurred as the air grew thin, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. And then the darkness moved. The mass at the center of the circle began to expand, its tendrils reaching out toward the van. They were thick and sinewy, their surfaces glistening with an oily sheen. They moved with terrifying speed, slamming into the van with a force that sent it skidding backward. The group was thrown into chaos, their screams drowned out by the deafening roar of the entity's approach. The tendrils wrapped around the van, squeezing it like a giant hand. The windows shattered under the pressure, shards of glass flying inward as the walls of the vehicle buckled. And then everything stopped. The van was still. The fog receded slightly, leaving the group gasping for air. But the respite was brief. Through the shattered windshield, they saw the pale figures step closer, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers returned, but this time they carried a single, chilling message. You were warned. The realization dawned too late. The phone call, the roadblock, the warnings, they weren't coincidences. They had been given a chance to turn back, to escape the jungle before it claimed them. But they hadn't listened, and now it was too late. The ground beneath the van gave way, crumbling into the abyss as the entity's tendrils pulled them into the darkness. The van plunged into the abyss, swallowed whole by the darkness below. The group's screams were lost to the deafening roar of the entity, a sound that was neither animal nor human, but something far older and far worse. The world around them dissolved into chaos, a maelstrom of shadows, tendrils, and cold, suffocating fog. For a brief, horrifying moment, there was nothing but freefall. The group clung to each other, their bodies weightless as the van tumbled through the void. The rhythmic rumble became a relentless pounding, a sound so loud and all-encompassing it seemed to echo inside their very bones. And then, everything stopped. The van came to a sudden, jarring halt, though there was no crash, no impact. It simply ceased moving, as though the void itself had swallowed all momentum. The silence that followed was suffocating, an oppressive void that pressed against their ears and minds. One by one, they opened their eyes. The van was intact, its cabin eerily still. The jagged holes in the roof were gone, the shattered windows restored. The group sat in their seats, dazed and trembling, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the fog had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable blackness that stretched in every direction. There was no road, no jungle, no sound. Marta reached for the flashlight, her hands shaking as she fumbled to turn it on. The beam pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but an endless void. The light didn't reflect off any surface. It simply disappeared into the emptiness, as though swallowed by the air itself. Pedro's voice broke the silence, a low, trembling whisper that carried a weight of despair. He pointed toward the windshield, where faint shapes began to emerge from the void. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct and formless. But as they drew closer, their features became clear. It was them. Their own faces stared back at them from the darkness, twisted and pale, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The doppelgangers stood motionless, their expressions vacant yet menacing. They were exact replicas of the group, down to the smallest detail. The same clothes, the same scars, the same terror etched into their faces. And then the figures moved. They stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The group in the van was paralyzed, unable to look away as their doubles reached the windows and stared inside. The lifeless eyes seemed to bore into their souls, unearthing every fear, every regret, every sin they had ever buried. The whispers returned, but now they were inside their heads. The voices spoke in unison, a chilling chorus that carried the weight of finality. You ignored the warning. Now you belong to us. The van's engine roared to life on its own, its headlights flickering weakly. The vehicle began to move, but none of them were touching the controls. It rolled forward into the darkness, the doppelgangers walking alongside it, their hollow eyes never leaving the group inside. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping and merging until they became an incomprehensible roar. The van picked up speed, hurtling toward an unseen destination. The group screamed and pounded on the doors, but it was useless. The vehicle was no longer theirs to control. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the motion stopped. The van was back on the road, its tires resting on solid ground. The jungle stretched out before them, eerily quiet and bathed in the faint light of dawn. The fallen tree was gone, the path ahead clear and unobstructed. For a moment, the group sat in stunned silence. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, their bodies trembling as they tried to process what had happened. The rhythmic rumble was gone, the whispers silenced. It was as if the nightmare had ended. But something was wrong. Lucas reached for the rearview mirror, his heart sinking as he caught sight of his own reflection. His eyes were hollow, black voids that stared back at him with lifeless intensity. He turned to the others, his voice trembling as he pointed to their faces. They were all the same: hollow eyes, pale skin, and expressions devoid of life. They were no longer themselves. The realization hit them like a tidal wave. They had escaped the jungle, but not intact. The entities had taken something essential, something that made them who they were. As the van continued down the empty road, a single sound broke the silence. It was the faint, rhythmic rumble, distant but unmistakable. The jungle wasn't done with them, and as the dawn broke over the horizon, the whispers began again. The van rolled down the dirt road, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost as if gliding rather than driving. The group sat in stunned silence, the weight of their realization suffocating them. The jungle outside was eerily calm, bathed in the soft, amber glow of dawn. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled gently through the leaves, as if the nightmarish events of the past hours had never happened. But inside the van, nothing felt normal. Pedro stared at his hands, turning them over repeatedly as though trying to prove they were still his. His skin was unnaturally pale, his veins faintly visible beneath the surface. Marta clutched a small silver necklace she always wore, her fingers trembling as she pressed the cold metal into her palm. It didn't feel real anymore, its weight foreign and meaningless. Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror again, unable to look away from his hollow eyes. They weren't just empty, they were wrong. The black voids reflected nothing, not the faint light from the road, nor the growing daylight. It was as if his eyes had become windows to something else, something far darker than the jungle they had left behind. Pedro finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked if they were dead. The question hung in the air, unanswered but suffocatingly present. None of them knew the truth, but deep down they all felt it. Something had shifted. The van slowed on its own, coming to a halt at a fork in the road. The two paths stretched out before them, one leading deeper into the jungle, and the other heading toward a distant village barely visible in the morning haze. The choice should have been simple, but none of them could bring themselves to speak. Marta reached for the door handle, the urge to escape the confined space overwhelming her. As she stepped out, the warm light of dawn hit her face, and for a fleeting moment she felt relief. But then she saw them. They were everywhere. The pale figures stood at the edge of the jungle, their hollow eyes watching silently from the shadows. They were no longer confined to the fog or the abyss. They had followed them here, their presence a stark reminder that the group's nightmare was far from over. Lucas joined Marta outside, his legs shaky as he took in the sight. The figures didn't move or make a sound, but their intent was clear. They weren't letting the group leave. Pedro stumbled out next, his breathing shallow as he stared at the path leading to the village. The road seemed to shimmer, as if it wasn't entirely real. He tried to step forward, but his foot stopped short, as though an invisible wall blocked his path. Marta tested it too, her hands pressing against the air. It was solid, unyielding. They couldn't leave. A distant sound broke the silence, the rhythmic rumble, faint but growing louder. The group turned back toward the jungle, where the sound originated. The figures at the edge of the trees parted, creating a path that led deeper into the shadows. The message was clear. They had to go back. The whispers returned, their sharp, guttural voices cutting through the air. They spoke directly into their minds, filling their thoughts with images and commands. The words weren't in any language they knew, but the meaning was unmistakable. They belonged to the jungle now. Lucas felt his feet move involuntarily, his body drawn toward the path as though pulled by invisible strings. Marta and Pedro followed, their attempts to resist futile. The van sat abandoned behind them, its engine dead and its headlights flickering weakly. As they walked, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and the air heavier. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that threatened to drown out their own thoughts. The rhythmic rumble became a steady pulse, echoing in their chests like a second heartbeat. And then they saw it again. The clearing, the pale figures, the massive, writhing mass of darkness at the center. It had been waiting for them. The entity pulsed with life, its surface shifting and churning as though alive with countless unseen horrors. The pale figures stood in their perfect circle, their hollow eyes fixed on the group as they approached. Marta tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, stolen by the jungle. Pedro dropped to his knees, his head in his hands as the whispers overwhelmed him. Lucas stood frozen, his hollow eyes locked on the mass before them. The entity's tendrils reached out, slow and deliberate, wrapping around each of them with a gentle but unyielding grip. There was no pain, no struggle, only silence. As the tendrils pulled them closer, the whispers changed. They were no longer sharp and guttural, but soothing, almost welcoming. The entity spoke to them directly, its voice filling their minds with a chilling calm. You were warned. You chose this path. Now you are ours. The group's vision blurred as the tendrils enveloped them completely, pulling them into the mass. The world dissolved into darkness, their bodies weightless and their thoughts no longer their own. Somewhere far away, the van sat abandoned at the fork in the road. Days passed, then weeks. Locals from the distant village whispered about the cursed jungle, about the strange fog and the pale figures that no one dared to approach. The van remained untouched, its headlights flickering weakly as though trying to warn anyone who might come too close. But no one ever did, and deep within the jungle, the entity stirred, its whispers reaching out once again. It was patient, ancient, and eternal. It knew more would come. They always did. Years later, the van was still there, rusted and half consumed by the encroaching jungle. Its tires were flat, its paint chipped and peeling, and vines had snaked through its undercarriage, lifting it slightly off the ground. The road was overgrown now, no longer a path, but a tangle of roots and vegetation that discouraged even the bravest wanderers. Locals in the nearby village spoke of the van of the lost in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay far from the cursed jungle. The stories were always the same. A group of college students, young and carefree, had ventured into the jungle decades ago and never returned. Their disappearance was unsolved, their fate a grim mystery that haunted the region. But some details were different. An elderly woman named Dona Celeste, the village's unofficial historian and keeper of local lore, often shared an older, eerier version of the tale. She claimed the jungle had always been a place of strange happenings, a realm where the boundaries between life and death, time and space, blurred and bled into one another. Long before the van arrived, there were stories of travelers who ventured into the jungle and emerged forever changed, or not at all. Hunters reported seeing figures in the fog, pale and hollow-eyed, who seemed to watch silently from the shadows. Farmers told of strange noises at night, a rhythmic rumble that made the ground tremble and sent livestock into a frenzy. Dona Celeste believed the jungle was alive, not just in the way all jungles teem with life, but in a deeper, more malevolent sense. She spoke of an ancient force buried beneath the earth, older than the trees, the rivers, or even the mountains. It was said to be a relic of a time when gods walked the earth, an entity that had been sealed away by forgotten rituals. But the seal was imperfect. The entity fed on fear and despair, luring the unwary into its domain with whispers and illusions. It was patient, waiting for those who ignored warnings and pushed past boundaries, tempting them deeper into its grasp. And once it claimed them, they were never truly gone. Dona Celeste's words often fell on skeptical ears, but her conviction was undeniable. She claimed she had seen the figures herself as a young girl, watching them from the safety of her family's home at the edge of the jungle. She described their eyes, empty yet filled with a haunting knowingness, and the way the fog moved with a will of its own. One night, years after the van's disappearance, a new story began to circulate in the village. A group of young thrill-seekers had arrived, hearing whispers of the cursed jungle and the mystery of the lost students. They were urban explorers, armed with flashlights, cameras, and bravado, determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. They never returned. Days later, a farmer found their gear scattered along the jungle's edge. The cameras were intact, their memory cards full of footage. What the farmer saw on those recordings sent him running back to the village, his face pale and his hands shaking. The videos showed the explorers walking through the jungle, laughing and joking as they ventured deeper. But as the hours passed, their demeanor changed. The fog closed in around them, and the rhythmic rumble began. The footage grew chaotic, shaky, as the explorers ran from something unseen. And then the final frames. A clearing, shrouded in fog. Pale figures standing in a circle. The massive, writhing darkness at the center, its tendrils reaching out. The camera fell to the ground, its lens capturing only the sound of whispers growing louder and louder until the recording cut to static. Donna Celeste was the first to speak when the story spread. She claimed the jungle was hungrier now, its whispers growing stronger, its reach extending further. The entity wasn't satisfied with just luring travelers into its domain. It wanted more. And then came the phone calls. People in the village began receiving strange calls at odd hours. The line would crackle with static, and a faint, rhythmic rumble would sound in the background. Sometimes there were whispers, indistinct and chilling. Those who answered the calls described a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to approach the jungle. Some resisted, others disappeared. The village dwindled over the years, its residents either fleeing or succumbing to the jungle's pull. By the turn of the century, it was nearly abandoned, a ghost town swallowed by vines and shadow. The jungle grew thicker, its boundaries spreading as though alive. And the van remained, a rusted sentinel at the edge of the jungle, its hollow headlights staring out like the eyes of those it had claimed. But the whispers carried further now, traveling through the static of radios, the hum of electricity, and the faint crackle of phone lines. The jungle was no longer content to wait for wanderers to come to it. It was reaching out, its ancient, malevolent hunger boundless and unending. Somewhere, far from the jungle, a phone rings. "Will you answer?"